At 12:01 in the morning, Eastern Time on August the 19th, a 50% tariff lands on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods heading into the United States. Not 50% on goods that broke the rules. Not 50% on the small sliver of Canadian exports that never qualified for free trade in the first place. 50% on goods that followed every rule in the book. Goods stamped, certified, and cleared under the very free trade agreement that was supposed to protect them. That is the detail that changed everything about this dispute. And it is the reason officials in Ottawa are now calling this moment a cliff. For almost 3 decades, companies on both sides of the border built their entire business models around one assumption. If a product is compliant with the free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, known in Canada as CUSMA, and known in the U.S. as USMCA, that product crosses the border duty-free. It was the foundation. Auto parts crossed back and forth between Windsor and Detroit 5, 6, 7 times before a vehicle was finished, and every one of those crossings assumed compliant goods stayed protected. Dairy shipments, lumber shipments, machinery, furniture, all of it moved on that same assumption. According to a White House fact sheet released alongside the new measures, that assumption no longer holds, at least not for the categories the administration has now targeted. To understand how deep this cuts, you need to go back to where the fight actually started, because this did not begin in July. It began in November of 2024, when the incoming Trump administration first announced its intention to impose 25% tariffs on all Canadian and Mexican goods, citing concerns over fentanyl trafficking and migration across the northern and southern borders. That threat set off more than a year of on-again, off-again tariff actions, delays, exemptions, partial rollbacks, and fresh escalations that most people trying to follow Canadian trade policy struggled to keep straight in real time. Throughout much of that period, CUSMA-compliant goods were repeatedly carved out. Trump would announce a tariff, and then, often within days or weeks, an exemption would follow for goods that met the free trade agreement's rules of origin. That pattern held for the better part of a year and a half. Then, in February of 2026, the legal landscape shifted. The Supreme Court struck down the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEEPA, as the legal basis for sweeping unilateral tariffs. The court held that IEEPA did not grant the president authority to impose broad import duties without a more specific statutory basis. For a moment, it looked like it might blunt the administration's tariff strategy. Instead, it appears to have redirected it. Rather than retreating from tariffs as a tool, the White House began working through the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Framework and a set of alternative statutory authorities. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act for national security-related duties on steel, aluminum, and copper. And, as of this summer, a provision almost nobody outside trade law circles had ever heard of, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and it's worth slowing down for, because the history matters. Section 338 is a surviving fragment of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Yes, that Smoot-Hawley, the law economic historians widely blame for deepening the Great Depression by triggering a wave of retaliatory tariffs around the world in the early 1930s. Section 338 authorizes the president to impose additional tariffs of up to 50% on goods from a country found, as a matter of presidential fact-finding, to be discriminating against American commerce. According to legal analysis from the trade law firm Morrison Foerster, and separately confirmed by researchers at Global Trade Alert, this provision had not been used to impose tariffs even once in its nearly 100-year history. The Congressional Research Service, in a report published this past March, noted that Section 338 may have been referenced as leverage in trade negotiations decades ago, briefly considered against France and Spain in the 1930s, and weighed but never actually invoked against Germany and Australia in 1935. But, as far as researchers can determine, no American president had ever pulled the trigger on it, until July the 20th, 2026. On that Monday, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking Section 338 against Canada. Not one blanket order. 3 distinct proclamations, each targeting a different sector where the administration alleges discriminatory treatment, one covering motor vehicles, one covering alcoholic beverages, and one covering dairy products. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office under Jameson Greer, the justification centers on 3 specific grievances. First, that Canada has taken American alcohol products off store shelves in several provinces, a reference to the wave of provincial boycotts that followed earlier rounds of the trade war. Second, that Canada maintains a supply management system for dairy that imposes tighter quotas on American cheese than it does on cheese imported from the European Union, despite Canada holding trade agreements with both. And third, that Canada has capped vehicle exports from companies that were reshoring production to the United States. In Greer's own words, released through an official USTR statement, Canada has taken U.S. alcohol products off Canadian shelves, given better market access to dairy products from the European Union, and has put a cap on U.S. vehicle exports. The scope of what these three proclamations actually cover is worth walking through carefully, because the label motor vehicles is misleading. According to reporting from the Canadian financial outlet CFIB, and confirmed by multiple trade law firms tracking the proclamations line by line, the list labeled motor vehicles contains, despite its name, no cars at all. Instead, it covers electronics and telecom equipment, furniture, home goods, building materials like lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear, luggage, toys, sporting goods, hockey sticks and hockey equipment specifically get named in multiple reports, manufacturing machinery, cosmetics, fragrances, and agricultural products, including flowers, plants, and seeds. Layer on top of that the separate dairy list, milk, cream, whey, and related dairy ingredients, and the separate alcohol list, and you get a picture of roughly 554 individual tariff lines, according to trade researchers at Global Trade Alert, covering something in the neighborhood of $20 billion in Canadian exports to the United States. Why does the CUSMA compliance detail matter so much? Because, according to the White House's own language in the fact sheet accompanying the proclamations, these new 50% duties apply regardless of whether the product was included under the existing free trade agreement. That is a first. Reporting from Global News notes that this marks the first time Trump has explicitly stated, in the text of an executive order, that CUSMA-covered goods are not exempt. In every previous round of this trade war, including the tariffs tied to fentanyl concerns back in early 2025, CUSMA-compliant products were eventually carved out, even when the initial order didn't say so. This time, the exemption simply isn't there. And unlike some of the administration's other tariff tools, which come with built-in expiration dates or sunset clauses, Section 338 duties, according to legal analysis from BLG law firm, appear to have no expiry date written into the statute at all. Once imposed, they continue indefinitely unless the president himself decides to modify, reduce, or terminate them. There's an even sharper edge buried in the statute that almost nobody outside trade law had noticed until recently. Section 338 doesn't cap out at 50% as a permanent ceiling. According to the trade law analysis from BLG, if the president later finds that the discriminatory practice he identified has been maintained or increased, even after the 50% duty is in place, the statute authorizes him to go further, to exclude the country's products from importation altogether. Not a higher tariff rate, an outright embargo. Trade lawyers reviewing the proclamations describe this escalation ladder as something genuinely unprecedented in the modern era of American trade policy, a tool built in 1930 that nobody expected to see, revived nearly a century later, and certainly not against Canada, historically Washington's closest and most integrated trading partner. So how has Ottawa responded? Prime Minister Mark Carney did not stay quiet. In a statement posted to his official account and reported by Al Jazeera, Carney called the new tariffs the latest in a series of unilateral U.S. trade actions, and said they stood in direct violation of the trilateral free trade agreement. He went further, laying out the broader arc of the dispute. Recognizing that the U.S. has been transforming all of its trade relationships, including those covered under CUSMA, over the past 18 months, Canada has made a series of detailed and comprehensive proposals to resolve this dispute and to modernize CUSMA. That framing, proposals made, modernization offered, and still met with escalation, has become the core of Ottawa's public messaging through the summer. The timing of the July 20th announcement landed awkwardly for Canadian politics. According to CBC News, the proclamations were signed just as the country's 13 premiers were gathering in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, for their annual summer meeting. Before Trump's announcement, the premier's agenda had been packed with domestic priorities: healthcare transfers, energy development, economic growth, and the wildfires that had been burning through swaths of northern Ontario. Within hours, all of that got pushed aside. Trump, as CBC put it, was suddenly taking up the oxygen in the room, getting 13 provincial leaders representing wildly different regional economies, from Alberta's energy sector to Ontario's auto manufacturing base to Atlantic Canada's fisheries, to agree on a single united response was never going to be simple, and reporting from that period suggests it wasn't. Public opinion in Canada has been strikingly consistent throughout this fight, and it's worth pausing on the numbers because they explain why Carney's government has stayed firm rather than folding. According to a survey conducted by the Angus Reid Institute and cited by BNN Bloomberg, just 7% of Canadians surveyed said the country should capitulate to U.S. demands simply to avoid the tariffs. Separate polling referenced by Global News found Canadians overwhelmingly supportive of retaliation rather than concession. That is a remarkably narrow band of public appetite for backing down, and it has shaped the political incentives on the Canadian side of these negotiations from the very start. Now here's where the story moves from proclamation to negotiation, and where the most recent on-the-ground reporting becomes critical, because things have moved fast in the first 2 weeks of August. Dominic LeBlanc, the federal minister responsible for Canada-U.S. relations, traveled to Washington alongside Janice Charette, Canada's chief trade negotiator to the United States, in the days immediately following the July 20th announcement. According to CTV News, LeBlanc's office would not specify in advance who he intended to meet or how long he planned to stay, a sign of just how fluid the diplomatic footing had become. By early August, Prime Minister Carney was speaking publicly and often about where negotiations stood. On August the 5th, according to CBC News, Carney told reporters that Canadian negotiators were focused on what he called all strategic sectors, explicitly including the automotive industry as the clock ticked down toward the tariff deadline. He said he was personally very involved in the talks his negotiating team was conducting in Washington, not a passive observer waiting for updates, but someone directly shaping Canada's positioning in real time. Then, on August the 5th as well, in a separate CTV News report, Carney described the tone of the negotiations in a phrase that's been quoted widely since. Talks with Washington remain quite firm on Canada's side, even as he insisted the overall negotiating relationship stays constructive. It's a careful piece of political language, firm but not hostile, constructive but not conciliatory, and it reflects the tightrope Ottawa has been walking since July. Push too hard and you risk the kind of rupture that halts talks altogether. Fold too easily and you risk the domestic backlash that polling suggests would follow. That risk of rupture became explicit just days ago. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail, published August the 11th and updated August the 12th, Canada's chief negotiator Janice Charette delivered a direct warning to her American counterparts in a meeting with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. 5 sources briefed on the discussions told the Globe and Mail that Charette warned the White House that if the 50% tariffs go into effect as scheduled on August the 19th, the move would represent what she called a cliff, a moment that risks halting negotiations with the United States altogether, not just souring them. 4 of the 5 sources who spoke to the Globe and Mail described the warning in similar terms. Not a threat, exactly, but a statement of consequence, an attempt to make clear to Washington that imposing the tariffs on schedule could collapse the very talks meant to prevent them. That single word, cliff, has become something of a shorthand for where this dispute now sits. Everything built over 18 months of on and off negotiation, every proposal Ottawa says it has put forward to modernize CUSMA, every round of talks LeBlanc and Charette have conducted in Washington, all of it now hinges on what happens in the roughly 48 hours before and after midnight on August the 19th. If a deal materializes before then, the 50% duties may never actually take effect, or may be scaled back before they bite. If no deal materializes, Canada faces a tariff regime unlike anything it has dealt with in this entire trade war. One that, for the first time, reaches goods that were supposed to be untouchable under free trade. What would that actually mean for people living through it? Not just exporters and factory towns, but ordinary Canadians doing their weekly shopping. According to reporting from Yahoo Finance Canada, published August the 10th, the headline, 50% number sounds like a problem confined to exporters and manufacturing regions. It isn't, or at least not entirely. Buried inside the ongoing negotiations are a handful of concessions Ottawa is reportedly willing to make. Concessions that could show up on store shelves and car lots well before the tariff deadline itself, regardless of how the broader dispute resolves. The categories affected read almost like a full inventory of a Canadian household: dairy products, alcohol, electronics, furniture, building materials, clothing, footwear, toys, and, yes, according to multiple outlets tracking the proclamation's exact language, hockey sticks and hockey equipment specifically named among the covered goods, a detail that has drawn no shortage of wry commentary in Canadian media given the sport's cultural weight north of the border. It's worth being precise here about what has already happened versus what remains provisional, because that distinction matters, and it would be dishonest to blur it. The 3 Section 338 proclamations are signed. They are real, dated documents on file with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, confirmed by the White House's own fact sheet, and independently verified by multiple trade law firms including Fasken, Morrison Foerster, and Thompson Hine, who each published detailed legal analyses for their corporate clients in the days following July 20th. The August 19th effective date is likewise confirmed across every major outlet tracking this story: CBC, Al Jazeera, Global News, and the trade press. What remains genuinely uncertain, as of this recording, is whether those tariffs will actually take effect as written, whether a last-minute agreement will blunt or delay them, or whether, as Charette's warning suggests is a live possibility, the whole negotiating process could stall out entirely if Washington proceeds regardless. There's also an important asymmetry worth naming honestly. Canada has not, as of the most recent reporting from Fasken's Trade Law Bulletin, announced any retaliatory tariffs of its own in response to the July 20th proclamations. That's a notable departure from earlier phases of this trade war, when Ottawa moved relatively quickly to match American tariff actions with its own counter-tariffs on U.S. goods, steps that in some cases were later partially unwound. Back in August of 2025, for instance, Carney's government announced it would remove certain retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods that were compliant with CUSMA, a decision that drew, according to global news coverage at the time, a genuinely mixed reaction domestically. Some welcomed the de-escalation, others saw it as a concession offered without getting much in return. This time, Fasken's analysis notes that while the Carney government hasn't ruled out retaliation in the future, it has held off so far, apparently betting that the negotiating table offers more leverage than another round of tit-for-tat duties. It's also worth stepping back and putting some hard numbers around what's actually at stake economically, because the scale of Canada-U.S. trade is easy to lose in the back and forth of individual tariff announcements. According to reporting from CTV News citing trade data, Canadian exports to the United States totaled roughly $163 billion U.S. dollars in just the first 5 months of 2026 alone, from January through May. Against that backdrop, the $20 billion in goods now facing the new 50% duty represents a meaningful slice, though not the majority, of the overall trading relationship. The White House's own fact sheet points to specific shifts it credits to prior rounds of tariff pressure. From April 2025 through March 2026, Canadian imports of American motor vehicles reportedly fell by approximately 22%, or $5.6 billion, compared to the same period a year earlier. And from March 2025 through February 2026, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages dropped by roughly 81%, a staggering figure of about $582 million, which the administration points to as direct evidence of the provincial boycotts it says justify the new tariffs in the first place. Washington's broader framing throughout this dispute has centered on the claim that Canada is something of an outlier among American trading partners. According to the White House fact sheet, over the past year and a half, only 2 countries chose to retaliate against Trump's tariffs, rather than negotiate settlements with the United States, the People's Republic of China and Canada. That framing, Canada grouped alongside China as one of only 2 holdout nations, has been a recurring talking point from administration officials trying to justify the escalation, even though the 2 countries' trading relationships with the United States and their historical alliance status could not be more different. On the Canadian side, the picture painted by Carney's government is almost a mirror image. Not a country refusing to negotiate, but a country that has been negotiating in good faith for 18 months while the goalposts kept moving. Whether you find Washington's framing or Ottawa's framing more persuasive likely depends on which side of the border you're standing on. And that's precisely the kind of genuinely contested claim where honesty requires saying so rather than picking a side and presenting it as settled fact. Let's return for a moment to the legal mechanics, because they matter for understanding what happens next, regardless of how the immediate August 19th deadline resolves. Trade lawyers reviewing the Section 338 proclamations have flagged something structurally unusual. Unlike Section 122 of the Trade Act, which caps emergency tariff actions at 150 days before requiring congressional approval to continue, Section 338 carries no such built-in expiration. According to the legal analysis published by BLG, the proclamations advance an interpretation under which these tariffs can continue indefinitely, not for 150 days, not for a year, but until the president himself chooses to reduce, modify, or terminate them. That's a meaningfully different legal posture than the emergency powers tariffs the Supreme Court struck down back in February, and part of why trade lawyers described the administration's pivot to Section 338 as, in the words of one ex-post from trade analyst Peter Harrell that circulated widely among trade policy watchers, essentially pulling the trigger on a tool that had sat loaded and unused since the Roosevelt administration debated it in the 1930s. Harrell's initial public reaction, posted the same day the proclamations were signed, offered a useful real-time gut check on the scale involved. His early estimate, which he explicitly flagged as a rough AI-assisted calculation rather than an official figure, put the value of covered U.S. imports somewhere around $40 billion, or about 10% of total American imports in the relevant categories, though official figures from the White House and trade researchers subsequently converged closer to the $20 billion figure now widely cited. The discrepancy is worth noting honestly, rather than smoothing over. Early reactions to a fast-moving trade announcement don't always match the final, verified numbers that emerge once trade lawyers and government analysts have had time to work through the actual tariff schedules line by line. So where does this leave things practically for the days remaining before the deadline? Ottawa's negotiating team, led by LeBlanc and Charette, remains in Washington, working what CBC has described as all strategic sectors of the relationship, with Ottawa singled out by Carney himself as a particular focus. The Globe and Mail's reporting on Charette's cliff warning suggests the Canadian side is trying every available lever short of retaliation to convince Washington that going ahead with the tariffs as scheduled would be self-defeating, that it would blow up the negotiating process rather than accelerating a resolution. Whether that argument lands with the White House, whether Trump chooses to delay or soften the measures the way he has delayed tariff deadlines in the past, recall that back in the summer of 2025, the administration pushed a reciprocal tariff deadline from July 9th to August 1st, or whether the 50% duties simply take effect at 12:01 a.m. on August the 19th as written remains genuinely unresolved as of this recording. What is not in dispute is the historical weight of what's already happened. For the first time in nearly a century, a president has actually used Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 to impose tariffs, not threaten them, not hold them in reserve as diplomatic leverage, the way Roosevelt-era officials reportedly considered and rejected, but actually sign the proclamations and put the machinery of enforcement in motion. And for the first time in this particular trade war, a set of tariffs has been written explicitly to reach goods that are fully compliant with the Free Trade Agreement. Canada, the United States, and Mexico all signed and ratified. The same agreement that was supposed to be the floor beneath this entire economic relationship. Not just another negotiating chip sitting on top of it. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where the verified information in this account comes from and where real uncertainty still remains. The core facts, the July 20th signing date, the Section 338 legal basis, the three proclamation structure covering motor vehicles, alcohol, and dairy, the August 19th effective date, and the roughly $20 billion scope, are confirmed consistently across the White House's own fact sheet, CBC News, Al Jazeera, Global News, and multiple independent trade law firms including Fasken, Morrison Foerster, BLG, and Thompson Hine, all of whom published legal bulletins analyzing the proclamations for their own clients. Prime Minister Carney's statements are drawn directly from his own public remarks, as reported by CBC and Al Jazeera. Janice Charette's warning to USTR is sourced to the Globe and Mail's reporting, which cites 5 separate sources briefed on the private discussions. A solid sourcing chain, though it's worth noting the underlying conversation itself was not conducted on the record. The Angus Reid polling figures come through BNN Bloomberg's citation of that survey, and the single point of genuine, unresolved uncertainty sitting over this entire story is the most important one. Whether the tariffs actually take effect as scheduled, whether a deal emerges in time to blunt them, or whether Charette's warned of cliff becomes reality. As of this recording, that outcome has not yet been determined, and any claim to know it in advance would be exactly the kind of thing this channel won't pretend to report as settled fact. It's worth going a layer deeper into what actually preceded Section 338, because the tariff landscape Canada has been living under didn't spring up overnight, and understanding the layers helps explain why the August 19th measures feel like such a departure from what came before. Even before the July 20th proclamations, Canadian exporters were already navigating a patchwork of separate tariff regimes running in parallel. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which has tracked the trade war closely for its member businesses, sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper remained in place under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the same national security-based authority the administration has used against multiple countries, not just Canada, with rates ranging from 15 to 50%, depending on the product category. On top of that, set a 25% tax on non-U.S. parts used in vehicle manufacturing, plus tariffs on lumber and other wood products under yet another set of rules. In February of 2026, following the Supreme Court's ruling against the broader IEEPA tariffs, U.S. Customs and Border Protection actually stopped collecting a 35% duty that had been applied to non-CUSMA compliant Canadian goods, replacing it with a lower 10% global tariff rate that took effect February the 24th. CUSMA compliant goods at that point remained exempt entirely, which is exactly the protection the new Section 338 measures now strip away for the specific categories they cover. The CFIB has also noted that Canadian businesses, which served as the importer of record and paid tariffs, later found to have been collected without proper legal authority, may be eligible for refunds, since duties charged without legal basis are considered invalid under U.S. law, a small silver lining buried in an otherwise punishing set of rules, though one that requires businesses to navigate their own claims process to recover anything. The Ferris-Bueller connection, oddly enough, keeps surfacing in serious trade law commentary, and it's worth explaining why, because it captures something real about how obscure this legal authority was before July. Section 338 sits inside the same 1930 Tariff Act that gave the world smoot-hawley, the law most famously referenced in the classic 1986 film when Ben Stein's droning economics teacher lectures a room full of half-asleep students about its role in deepening the Great Depression. For decades, that scene was arguably the statute's most famous cultural touchpoint, a punchline about protectionism gone wrong, not a live legal tool. Trade lawyers reviewing the current proclamations have leaned on that reference precisely because it underscores how thoroughly dormant Section 338 had become. The last confirmed use of the provision, according to legal analysis cited by Tech Times, dates back to 1949, 77 years before Trump's proclamations against Canada. No court has ever interpreted it in a published opinion. Trade officials researching the statute's history for the current dispute have noted that even Franklin Roosevelt's administration considered invoking Section 338 against Germany and Australia in 1935 over alleged discrimination against U.S. commerce, but ultimately chose to withdraw certain trade benefits through separate authority rather than actually impose duties under the provision. In other words, an American president looked at this exact tool 91 years ago and decided not to use it. Trump did. Why choose Section 338 at all when the administration has other tariff authorities available? According to analysis published by Thomson Reuters' tax and accounting community and echoed by multiple trade law firms, the appeal lies in its procedural simplicity. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 requires a formal investigation conducted by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative before tariffs can be imposed, a process that can take months. Section 232, the authority used for the steel, aluminum, and copper tariffs, requires the Commerce Department to conduct a formal national security investigation and issue findings before the president can act. Section 338, by contrast, requires none of that. The president simply has to find, as a matter of presidential determination, that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce. And the tariffs can follow almost immediately by proclamation alone. Trade lawyers have described this as the provision's core appeal to an administration that has repeatedly run into legal roadblocks, including the Supreme Court's rejection of the IEEPA tariffs, when it tried to move quickly using authorities with more procedural guardrails attached. The automotive dimension of this dispute deserves its own moment because it sits at the emotional and economic center of the Canada-U.S. relationship in a way few other sectors do. Vehicle parts have historically crossed the Windsor-Detroit border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly process, a level of integration built up over decades under NAFTA and then CUSMA. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has been one of the most vocal provincial leaders throughout this dispute. And reporting from Global News notes, he backed Carney's negotiating approach, even while pushing for a harder line at various points earlier in the trade war. The specific grievance the administration cites on autos, that Canada capped vehicle exports from companies reshoring production to the United States, points to a genuine tension in how both governments have tried to use trade policy to pull auto manufacturing jobs toward their own soil, each accusing the other of tilting the playing field in the process. It's also worth putting real texture on what the 50% tariff could mean for ordinary Canadian consumers in the weeks immediately following August 19th. Based on the reporting from Yahoo Finance Canada, the concessions reportedly under discussion in the negotiations, the ones that could show up in stores before any final deal is signed, touch categories most Canadians interact with directly: dairy products on grocery shelves, alcohol selection at provincial liquor stores, the price and availability of certain vehicles, and even everyday goods like furniture and building materials that matter enormously to anyone renovating a home or buying new appliances. Because the tariff, as written, applies at the point goods enter the United States rather than when they leave Canada, the most immediate financial pain falls on Canadian exporters and the American importers who buy from them. But economists who study cross-border supply chains have long noted that costs imposed anywhere along a tightly integrated supply chain tend to eventually work their way back through pricing on both sides of the border, even when the tariff itself is technically a one-directional tax. So here's the honest, open question worth sitting with. Canada has spent 18 months trying to negotiate its way through an increasingly aggressive tariff campaign, offering what Carney's office describes as detailed, comprehensive proposals to modernize the very agreement now being bypassed. Washington, for its part, argues Canada is one of only 2 countries in the world still choosing confrontation over accommodation. Somewhere in the gap between those two framings sits the actual truth of what's happening at the border. And in less than 2 weeks, that gap either closes with a deal, or it hardens into the first tariff regime in modern history to explicitly ignore the protections of a signed free trade agreement between 2 of the world's most integrated economies. What do you think happens at midnight on August the 19th? Does Ottawa get its deal, or does Washington let the deadline hit? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.